China-Arab relations. What's next as ties grow stronger? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. China's relationship with Arab countries continues to grow stronger both at economic and diplomatic levels. At the recent 10th Arab-China Business Conference hosted by Saudi Arabia in Riyadh, some 30 investment agreements worth $10 billion were signed on just the first day. The Saudi Deputy Investment Minister outlined some of the sectors where the sides are cooperating.
The partnership with the Chinese companies opens the doors, not just the usual chemicals or energy, but also into real estate, high-tech infrastructure. The range of possibilities between Saudi Arabia, the Arab world, and the Chinese is infinite.
So what will all of this mean, and how much of an impact will it have for the Arab world and China? To learn more about that, joining me now from London is Salman Al-Ansari. He is a Saudi political analyst and researcher. Also with us from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He is a senior fellow with the Taihe Institute, and he's the founder and chair of Asia Narratives. Joining the discussion here in Washington, D.C. is Paul Salem. He is president of the Middle East Institute. And also with us is Gong. He is a China forum expert and professor at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. Welcome to all of you. Salman, let me start with you. So there was that major Arab-China business conference that took place recently in Riyadh. Thousands of people in attendance, dozens of agreements signed worth billions of dollars. In fact, in 2022, trade between Arab countries and China surged to $430 billion. How important is China for Saudi Arabia's economy?
Thank you so much, Anand, and hi to your honorable guests and to all the viewers. Yeah, I believe the Saudi-Chinese relations is of high importance to the whole world's economy and for the whole world order. King Salman and President Xi took the bilateral relations to a new level when they both signed Riyadh, what is called the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. The overall trade volume between Riyadh and Beijing is growing exponentially, and Saudi Arabia is the biggest energy exporter in the world, and China is the biggest energy importer in the world. So that's why it's a very natural relation. So that's why it's important for both nations to capitalize on that and to strengthen their interests in all fields. China is definitely the biggest trading partner for the kingdom, and China understands that Saudi Arabia is the actual gate of all the Arab world. So that's why the Saudis managed to facilitate 3 summits, the Saudi-Chinese summit and the GCC Chinese summit and the Arab-Chinese summit. And they both, Saudi Arabia and China, have praised the signing of the alignment plan between Saudi Vision 2030 and the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So I think the future between the Arab countries, and specifically the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and China, is very positive, and we are looking forward to see more deepening of this important relation.
Gong, this is not just about oil, isn't it? I mean, if we look at the trade and economic relationship, it extends to things like manufacturing, electronics, infrastructure, and other fields as well. What kind of impact does this have on China?
Well, it seems to me it's kind of a gold rush right now in Saudi Arabia from the perspective of Chinese business people. I have several friends, you know, in the very respected investors, and I've heard stories from them that, you know, they just came back from Saudi to see that there's a booming phenomenon right now going on in Saudi Arabia. Chinese companies are moving in. Yeah, absolutely. As you said, it's more than just about oil and gas. I think, you know, from Saudi's perspective, you know, the MBS has a new vision for Saudi. It wants to transform the image of just an oil and gas country into a country of tomorrow that is based on high technology, that is based on innovation. And I think in this regard, Chinese companies have a huge room to play in several areas. And we know that Chinese companies are at the forefront of technology in innovation. I think particularly led by Saudi Arabia, and to some extent as well by United Arab Emirates, UAE. I think this is a time, a moment when the Saudis and other Arab countries are undergoing a sort of a rejuvenation, in my view, from a traditional sort of oil-producing countries into an era that is going to revive the glorious days of the Arab history in the past. And in that regard, there's a lot of room for cooperation between the Arab companies and Chinese companies. So I think this is a very good match. And if you're putting the angle of geopolitical, geostrategic considerations, and as you said, that as your previous guest has said, that Saudi is going to conduct a more of an independent foreign policy. Yeah. So it's very natural for both sides to be cooperative at this moment.
Einar Tangen, this business conference that we're talking about was just another step in what's becoming a much closer relationship between China and the Arab world. I mean, if we look at the summit that took place in December, President Xi Jinping was at that summit as well. Does what we see now underline that we are now in an ever-changing world, a multipolar world?
Well, absolutely. I mean, what you have here is, a realignment that's happening in the Middle East. And I'd like to stress the difference between the Arab world and the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. They have recently, especially in China, come together, and they're making more uniform decisions. They meet by themselves to decide issues, but amongst all of them, it's very, very clear that they feel the need to rebalance. And that rebalancing is reflective, as John pointed out, because of the nature of the business relationship. The fact that China is the largest customer, not only for Saudi Arabia, but also for the other countries, whether it's Qatar or UAE. And that has changed the dynamic. It's not something that's made Washington particularly happy. President Joe Biden was very upset. He took what were ordinary business decisions by the OPEC as a kind of personal affront, as some sort of issue where they were trying to influence the election that would be coming up in 2024. I think now Washington has the message that the Arab world is independent, that they will pursue what is best for their countries. And it's not a question of choosing between China and the United States. It's simply which is best for their particular countries at any particular time.
Paul Salem, great to have you with us on the show. Saudi Arabia is, of course, a major economy, but what impact will China's engagement with the region have on the broader Middle East region, involving other Arab states?
Well, as all of your guests have mentioned, China really has become the primary trading partner for most countries in the Middle East and North Africa. That's partly because it's the biggest energy importer in the region, is the biggest energy exporter, but it's also the world's factory, the world's manufacturer, and hence the countries of the region consume from China much more than they consume for other regions. Historically, the region used to be oriented economically first to Europe and then to the United States for many years. It's very, very clear that the region economically is much more oriented towards China now and in the future. That, of course, as some of your guests has mentioned, also involves a lot of high-tech issues, artificial intelligence, alternative energies, wind power, solar power, the technology that's being developed in China, electric vehicle technology, minerals for that electric transformation. So there really is a huge synergy between the economies of the region and the economies of China. The transformation, I would say, in a very normal way, this boosts the economies of the region. This is places where they can export their own products, energy and others. It's a country from which they can import high quality, low cost products for their own economies. We haven't mentioned, obviously, that China is one of the biggest investors in infrastructure. In previous decades, back in the 1950s or 60s, it used to be the US and others that were the biggest investors in infrastructure. That is currently China. China is also the biggest general sort of provider of aid packages in terms of investment and so on, that rivals that of the World Bank and the IMF. So really, China economically, financially, infrastructure-wise, casts a very, very long shadow and makes the region or the world, at least in the economic sense, a multipolar world.
Salman, Paul was talking about Chinese investment in infrastructure. Of course, Saudi Arabia has this very ambitious development plan. It's known as Vision 2030. And the country's deputy investment minister says China's Belt and Road Initiative could help with infrastructure development in Saudi Arabia. Let's listen to what he had to say.
If you look at the Vision 2030 and you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, you'll find that the areas of overlap are tremendous. And having the Saudi West Coast on the Maritime Silk Road puts all those cities at the West Coast at a unique position to connect the three worlds with China. So Africa, Asia, and Europe can be connected through this. So bringing goods and commodities from Africa to bring added value and ship it back to Asia or to Europe is easier.
Salman, the theme of the recent conference was collaborating for prosperity. How important will Saudi engagement be in the Belt and Road Initiative for its own development?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia looks at this huge mega project of the Chinese government, the BRI, with very big level of optimism, because it will work on the idea of win-win approach, because everyone will be benefiting from this mega project, and it's historic. It's going to be one of the biggest projects of logistics, of transportation ever. So I think the kingdom is very keen to have this kind of alignment, because let's not forget that Vision 2030, around 38% of the provisions of the points there are all about industrial advancements, etc. So the kingdom is very interested in pushing forward its industrial plans, and who is the best to partner with is definitely China. And as the minister has mentioned, Saudi Arabia is in a very logistic or in a very strategic kind of location in the world. It's just right in the middle of the world, where it can connect Africa, Asia, and Africa, Asia, and Europe. So, and let's not forget also the three straits, the Strait of Mandab, the Hormuz, and also the Suez Canal. They're all around the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And the kingdom, as the hub of the Arab and Muslim world, it definitely can help along with the BRI project and align it with its own Vision 2030, because it's one of the most progressive and promising vision that we have witnessed in the Middle East. And the kingdom is leading by example with regards to its development model. And there is also one thing that is very important to mention, which is the fact that the Chinese government had successfully entered one of the things that has always been complicated in the Middle East, which is the dialogue between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the brokering of this kind of relations. We should not forget that economy needs security. To have a prosperous economy, you need a good security. So the Chinese government successfully managed to have this kind of brokerage between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran, which will help to save the interest for both countries and also the interest of the Chinese country. So in general, we are all optimistic, but there is also one thing that I need to mention, that so many people speak about the multipolarity, which is true. It is a multipolar world right now. Unipolarity is over, but at the same time, we should not having it from a dichotomy kind of, a false dichotomy kind of approach, where these Middle Eastern countries need to be with one side against the other. No, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is absolutely committed to their strategic and historic relations with its allies either in the West, the United States, and Europe. And speaking of the U.S. as definitely the second trading partner for Saudi Arabia, the relations with China should never be an obstacle for us to pursue our relations with our Western allies.
John Gong, we heard the Saudi minister there tell us that the Belt and Road can help the Arab world connect with Asia, connect with Africa, and with Europe as well. So how crucial is the Middle East for China's rollout of the BRI?
Well, certainly, I would comment that his vision for the relationship among Saudi and the African countries and as well as the Europe region and China is a very interesting idea. Ways to be seen whether this can be materialized. I think it's a fascinating vision representing a lot of opportunities. I guess he's more talking about adding value and doing some kind of a processing based on products and raw materials imported from Africa and then shipped to the rest of the world. And I think that's a very interesting idea, and I would certainly like to see this moving forward and to be more materialized. Now, regarding this region's importance to China, I think if you look at today's world, look at China's trading pattern, the Middle East represents a very large opportunity, a huge opportunity, especially I think in addition to the trade side, more probably on the investment side. This area represents a relatively stable political situation. It's not so much subject to coercive pressure from the United States. And it's devoid of this kind of ideological and human rights issues. And I think it's also more important. I think it's also a region that has relatively high per capita income. So it's actually a very ideal situation for Chinese companies. We know that, especially I think for technology companies like Huawei, like the electric car companies here in China, as you mentioned, and a slew of other technology areas represents a lot of opportunities. So I think this area overall is very important to China, and also have to add that this region has a very complicated political situation. You have the Arab world, you have the Persian world, you have the Jewish world, right? But I think China's approach in this region is very different from the United States. It's not going to pick sides. It's not going to drive any wedge. It wants to be friends to every party and foe to none. So China likes to maintain good relations with Iran, with Saudi Arabia, and as well as with Israel. I just give you one example. Reportedly, Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, is supposed to visit Beijing. And you think about it, China just brokered a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and China is ready to welcome Israel's Prime Minister's first foreign visit. And that speaks volume about China's role in the Middle East.
Paul Taylor, John Gong, they're talking about China's diplomatic engagement with the region as well. As he mentioned, China played a crucial role in brokering that agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which led to the resumption of diplomatic ties between those two countries. How important is this for peace and stability in the region?
Well, first of all, it's very true that as China gains much more economic presence, it therefore gains economic leverage, it gains political leverage. Obviously, it is a global capital, a global power, and it is beginning to use that in diplomatic initiatives in the Middle East. For many years, they shied away from diplomatic activity, leaving it to the Americans or the Europeans or indeed the Russians. It's very true that China's interests are, in general, to de-escalate. It does not take sides. It wants a region that is stable, a region that is not subject to sudden shocks. It needs energy prices to be stable. It needs the waterways to remain open. So its interests generally go in that general direction. This, I think, is generally a positive sign. The Saudi-Iranian agreement was the real sort of the first major initiative of that kind. We have yet to see major initiatives in other arenas. Another breakthrough that's happened in the last few years, of course, mentioning Israel, was the Abraham Accords, which, of course, was brokered by the Trump administration. The U.S. is trying to broker a deal with Saudi Arabia and Israel. But as your previous panelist said, it's very interesting that these initiatives and relationships are overlapping each other rather than contradicting each other. That Saudi Arabia, while pursuing talks with the Americans, even with the Israelis, has very warm relations with China. Israel is an ally of the US, but Netanyahu is going to China. That is a position that China is in, that it can leverage for more stability and more de-escalation in the region. Everybody in the region is afraid that Chinese-American competition might create conflict, might make things worse. But I think the great opportunity is that it should be able to make things better in win-win solutions, whether it relates to the economy. We haven't mentioned the very important COP28 happening in the UAE in a few months to tackle the globe's biggest challenge and the region's biggest challenge, which is climate change. The region is already the hottest region in the world, and it needs certainly a lot of global and regional coordination to face the challenges just from climate change alone.
Einar Tangen, do you think that China's growing trade and economic relationship with the region will evolve significantly in the years ahead into a more strategic partnership, or would perhaps get China involved more diplomatically in the region?
Well, I think both. The economic engagement is huge. I mean, I have many friends, both in government and also in business, who have been making their way to the Middle East, going to the major countries there. In many cases, they're looking for financing. But, you know, the initial attempts are sometimes clumsy. People don't prepare well enough. And it's not, let us say, it doesn't necessarily result in anything, but that will change. If you start listening to what the ambassadors to China from these, especially GCC countries, are saying, they're interested in a long-term tie-up. They're investing heavily in China. They're rebalancing their portfolios that used to be almost exclusively American and European. They're now looking at China for opportunities, and a lot of that has to do with the market. Obviously, the differential in growth. You know, this year the U.S. will be at 1%, China will be at 5%. So, you know, it is going to evolve, not only from an investment point of view, but as I said, from a political point of view as well. I mean, right now, you couldn't have any more larger juxtaposition than the U.S., which continues to be involved in conflicts around the world. 81% of all conflicts since the end of World War II have involved the United States. China obviously lags in that particular statistic, and quite happily so. And it's quite the opposite. As my colleague pointed out, China is interested in peace and trade, not domination.
John Gong, you know, if we look at relationships, especially economic and trade relationships between countries right now, artificial intelligence, sharing technology, these are very big issues. How do you see China's future engagement in the Middle East in terms of AI, in terms of sharing technology?
Well, I think it's already happening, and I have no people and no stories of Chinese companies, you know, heavily investing in Dubai, for example, in Abu Dhabi. We're not talking about real estate or oil-related deals. These are, you know, highly, you know, high-tech cooperations, as you mentioned, in areas of AI, in areas of you know, telecommunications, even related to satellites, you know, rocket technologies. You know, these are very high-tech stuff, and it's amazing to see that you know, at the Arab world, especially heralded by countries like, you know, UAE and Qatar. You know, the Arab world is finally, you know, moving into this direction, totally dispensing with this sort of, you know, this derogatory image of the Arab world being backward and lagging behind. It's no longer anymore. I mean, look at the leading universities in Riyadh, in Dubai. These are very well-funded universities hiring the best staff, scientists, researchers, and they're doing amazing work, fascinating high-tech stuff. So I think I think that the high-tech and technology and innovation potential of the Arab world, in my view, is grossly underestimated. And I think in a few more years we're going to see more stories, more breakthroughs coming from the Arab world. I'm reasonably confident that something like that will happen in the next few years.
Salman, one other point I want to talk about, as Saudi Arabia focuses on economic growth, on diversifying its economy, Paul Salem was talking a moment ago about climate change. I mean, how much of a priority is that for Saudi Arabia? It is, of course, as Paul pointed out, in a region which is seeing the effects of climate change right now.
Absolutely. It's a big challenge, actually, and I'm happy that you guys mentioned it. And one of the things that the kingdom has actually done with that regard, they have had the biggest forestation project in the world with a plant that is called the Green Middle East, which is a plan to plant more than 40 billion trees in the Middle East, 10 of which to be inside Saudi Arabia. And if you go to Saudi Arabia to go to Riyadh or any other city, you will see that they have already started to plant these trees and to work on that. On the other side, they are also working on their mega projects to be completely sustainable, just like the Line, Neom, and some of the islands in the Red Sea, to be completely run by solar energy and by green hydrogen. Saudi Arabia doesn't want to become only, because it is already the biggest energy producer or exporter, but they also want to become the biggest clean energy producer and exporter. So that's a very promising plan with regards to the green and blue hydrogen, and it's going to be run mostly in the northern part of Saudi Arabia. And and also there's this plan of the solar panels that will be among the biggest in the world to be in the northern part. So I think overall the Saudis are actually working on the right track with regards to having the climate change to be tackled, etc. And overall, with regards to the Arabs and Chinese, I always say this, that both nations, the Arabs and the Chinese, have human civilizations that contributed to humanity in every field.
Right.
And I think the Saudis and Chinese want to replicate their ancient legacy. So that's why I'm full of optimism.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us on this discussion. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C.